99% of people are unaware of a hidden code in the apocalypse. Perhaps you've already read this book and felt fear, confusion, or simply given up trying to understand it. But the problem isn't you. 99% don't realize what's hidden in the pattern, not in the words. Today, you're going to see the apocalypse in a way that almost no one else has seen it before. The book of Revelation is undoubtedly the most misunderstood book in the entire Bible. Not because it is confusing by chance, but because almost no one has been taught to read it correctly. From early on, it has been reduced to a simple and frightening idea: catastrophes, monsters, destruction, and the literal end of the world. This superficial reading has transformed Revelation into a book of fear, when in fact it was written as a book of revelation. The very name says it all. Revelation does not mean end. It means revealing what was hidden. The problem begins when the text is read as a common, literal account, as if John were describing physical scenes from the future and not using deeply symbolic language. Apocalyptic writing doesn't function like a news report. It communicates through images, metaphors, patterns, and numbers. Each beast, each seal, each trumpet carries meanings that go far beyond appearances. When this language is ignored, the reader gets lost, becomes frightened, or simply closes the book thinking it wasn't meant to be understood. And that's exactly what happens with most people. They read Revelation like they read any other text, quickly skimming over repetitions, numbers, and sequences that seem too strange. What almost no one realizes is that these repetitions are not errors or exaggerations. They are clues. A revelation was constructed as a system, and within that system, numbers and patterns function as keys. Those who try to understand it only through the words see confusion. Those who learn to see the patterns finally begin to see meaning. To understand the code of Revelation, one must first understand something the Bible makes clear from beginning to end. God also communicates through numbers. They don't appear as mere decoration or coincidence. From Genesis to Revelation, numbers function as a silent language, capable of conveying ideas, cycles, and intentions that words alone cannot carry. When this language is ignored, the message loses depth. When it is recognized, everything begins to fall into place. The number 3, for example, always points to testimony, confirmation, something that is established. 7 appears as a symbol of fullness, completion, totality. 10 represents order and completeness, from commandment to structure. 12 is linked to government, authority, and divine organization, whether in the tribes of Israel or the apostles. 40 marks periods of trial, preparation, and transition. None of this is random. These numbers are repeated because they carry meaning, and the attentive reader learns to recognize them as signs. In Revelation, this language intensifies. Numbers don't just appear. They structure the book. Seals, trumpets, bowls, days, months, years. Everything follows a precise mathematical pattern. Even the most feared number, 666, ceases to be merely a symbol of terror when understood within this system. It wasn't placed there to generate blind fear, but to communicate something specific through a code that only makes sense when observed within the whole. The mistake most people make is treating these numbers as mere curiosities or superstition. In Revelation, nothing is left to chance. Each number is a piece of the puzzle. And when you begin to see the text in this way, it becomes clear that the book was not written to confuse, it was written to be deciphered. This is where almost everyone goes wrong. Most people look for the secret of Revelation in isolated words, in the most shocking images, or in literal interpretations, when in fact, the true code is not in what is said, but in how everything was organized. Revelation was not written like a common text, with a linear beginning, middle, and end. It was constructed as a carefully structured system where form matters as much as content. When you start looking at the book from the outside, instead of just reading line by line, something strange happens. The same themes return. The same scenes seem to repeat themselves from different angles. Seals, trumpets, and bowls don't appear as random events, but as cycles that advance, deepen, and intensify. It's not careless repetition, it's a pattern, and pattern is language. Each cycle reveals the same reality, but in different layers, as if the text was spiraling, showing the same point from new perspectives. What seems confusing to those who read superficially becomes coherent to those who see the structure. The apocalypse functions as a map, not as a simple timeline. It presents principles, consequences, and processes that repeat themselves instead of fixed dates and schedules. That's why trying to understand Revelation through isolated phrases leads to frustration. The book demands a systemic reading. Seals connect to trumpets. Trumpets interact with bowls. Everything follows a rigid, almost mathematical, internal logic. When this structure begins to become visible, the feeling is inevitable. No matter how many times you've read the text before, it seems like you're seeing something you've never seen before, because until now, you were looking in the wrong place. The seven seals are often seen as a simple sequence of catastrophic events, but that is only the most superficial reading possible. When observed carefully, they reveal something much deeper. The seals function as layers of revelation, not as isolated events. Each seal does not negate the previous one, it deepens it. There is a clear order, an intentional progression, as if the text were pulling the reader further and further into the same scenario, but at different levels. The first seals present movements that seem external: power, conquest, conflict, scarcity. But as the seals progress, the focus shifts. Visible violence gives way to the invisible cause. What seemed like mere chaos begins to reveal a system at work, repeating the same principles in increasingly intense forms. This repetition is not redundancy, it is amplification. The apocalypse does not advance in a straight line, it deepens. The detail that almost no one notices lies precisely in this sequence. The seals don't tell 7 different stories, they tell the same story 7 times, each time removing another layer of the veil. That's why many readers feel confused. They expect novelty when the text is offering progressive revelation. The more the seal is opened, the less the book speaks of events, and the more it speaks of causes, choices, and accumulating consequences. When this logic becomes visible, the 7 seals cease to be a frightening mystery and become a carefully orchestrated warning. Not about a single moment in the future, but about a pattern that repeats itself whenever certain limits are crossed. And that's exactly where the tension increases, because this pattern doesn't belong only to the past, nor is it restricted to a distant time. One of the biggest mistakes when trying to understand Revelation is applying our modern notion of time to it, as if the book were describing a rigid chronological sequence of future events. But time within Revelation doesn't work that way. It doesn't just move forward. It returns, bends, overlaps. The text speaks of what was, what is, and what will be, as if everything were happening simultaneously, because within this logic, it is. Instead of a straight line, the apocalypse works in cycles. The same themes reappear, the same conflicts return, the same patterns manifest themselves in new forms. This does not mean that the prophecy failed or was repeated by mistake. It means that it operates in layers. Each cycle reveals the same principle, acting in different contexts, at different times, with different intensities. The past does not stay behind. It echoes. That's why certain visions seem to happen more than once, as if the book were going back in time. In fact, it's going deeper. Time in Revelation isn't just a count of days, months, or years, but a mechanism of revelation. It shows that the same mistakes produce the same results whenever they are repeated. The setting changes, the characters change, but the logic remains intact. When you understand this, something uncomfortable happens. The apocalypse ceases to be just a distant prediction and begins to function as a mirror. A mirror that reflects patterns that have already happened, that are happening now, and that will continue to happen as long as they are ignored. And this makes the book much closer and much more unsettling. Few elements of Revelation generate as much fear and curiosity as the beast and the number 666. Throughout the centuries, this number has been treated as a label, a signature of evil, something to be feared almost superstitiously. But that is precisely the mistake almost everyone makes. When the focus is fixed only on the number, the real message is lost. 666 was not presented as an isolated enigma, but as part of a much larger system. In the text itself, the number is described as something that needs to be understood, not just recognized. It doesn't point to just one person, but to a pattern of functioning. A pattern that repeats itself whenever power, control, and worship are organized in a way that contradicts what was established from the beginning. The number doesn't identify a specific individual. It describes a type of structure, a model that can take on different forms over time. In this context, the beast ceases to be merely a frightening figure and comes to represent systems that rise, dominate, fall, and then return in new forms. This is why the narrative seems familiar at different points in history. The mistake most people make is expecting a single final character when the apocalypse is warning about something much more recurrent and subtle. When you understand 666 as a code and not as a terror amulet, everything changes. Irrational fear gives way to perception, and the question ceases to be, who will be the beast, and becomes much more uncomfortable. How many times has this same pattern been before us, without us realizing it? After so many images of chaos, fall, and confrontation, something unexpected begins to emerge from Revelation. The book doesn't only speak of destruction. In fact, destruction was never the central point. From the beginning, Revelation presents itself as revelation, not annihilation. It doesn't simply describe the end of things, but the unveiling of what was hidden behind them. What falls is not the world itself, but the systems that were already corrupted. When this lens changes, judgment also takes on a different meaning. It ceases to be an instantaneous act of punishment and becomes understood as a process of exposure, of separation, of confrontation between what is true and what has been built upon illusion. The apocalypse does not announce destruction for pleasure, but transformation out of necessity. Everything that cannot be sustained is revealed and therefore crumbles. This perspective completely alters the way the book is read. Instead of a distant God observing the collapse of creation, the text presents a continuous movement of correction. Judgment occurs as choices are made, patterns are maintained, and consequences accumulate. Nothing happens abruptly or arbitrarily. Revelation merely shows in symbolic language the inevitable result of repeated paths. Therefore, the book does not end in darkness. It moves towards restoration. The revelation is not about what will be destroyed, but about what will remain after all that was false is removed. And this is perhaps the most ignored part of all, because it requires less fear and much more reflection. When the apocalypse is read as a code of patterns, something becomes impossible to ignore. It is not limited to a single moment in history. What the book describes has happened before, happens again, and tends to repeat itself whenever certain structures are rebuilt. Empires rise, strengthen, centralize power, demand absolute loyalty, and inevitably collapse. The setting changes, the names change, but the mechanism remains the same. Throughout history, power systems have followed this almost predictable script. They promise order, security, and progress, but gradually begin to operate through control, exclusion, and fear. When this happens, The pattern described in Revelation comes into play not as an isolated supernatural event, but as a natural consequence of accumulated choices. The fall doesn't come from nowhere. It is built step by step. The most unsettling thing is realizing how precisely this cycle repeats itself. The apocalypse doesn't need to predict dates because it describes behaviors, and human behaviors rarely change. Whenever power becomes absolute, whenever systems begin to demand what they cannot give, the same outcome approaches. The revelation is not about when this will happen, but about how to recognize when it is happening. That's why the book remains relevant. It connects past, present, and future by showing that the code doesn't belong to a specific era. It manifests itself whenever the same fundamentals are reconstructed. And when you realize this, the feeling is inevitable. The apocalypse is not far off in time. It is active whenever these patterns realign. When these patterns are observed carefully, it becomes difficult not to notice how they begin to fit into the modern world. The apocalypse describes systems that operate through surveillance, control, and fear. And today, these elements do not appear as brute force, but as invisible structures integrated into daily life. Technology, which promises connection and freedom, has also become a powerful tool for monitoring, influencing, and directing behavior. None of this is presented as inherently evil, but as part of a system that, when absolute, tends toward imbalance. Global crises also follow the same script: economic instability, conflict, scarcity, collective fear. Each crisis is presented as an exception, but together they build a permanent state of tension. The apocalypse describes exactly this environment, not an instantaneous collapse, but a constant pressure that prepares the ground for extreme decisions and ever-increasing concentrations of power. The most important point is that the book doesn't force anyone to set dates or announce the imminent end. It functions as a warning, not a calendar. Whenever fear becomes a tool of control and the promise of security demands unrestricted obedience, the pattern reappears. And this isn't a specific prediction, it's a recurring observation. That's why the apocalypse remains so uncomfortably relevant. It doesn't describe modern technologies, but it accurately describes the effect certain systems produce when they reach their peak. The mystery lies not in knowing when it all ends, but in realizing how many times these signs have already appeared and how many more may yet emerge. Given all this, an inevitable question arises. If the apocalypse code is there, so well structured, why was it ignored for centuries? The answer is not simple, but it hinges on a central point: convenience. Reading Revelation literally has always been easier than confronting the complexity of its symbolism. Transforming the book into a story of future monsters and distant destruction distanced the responsibility of the present and made the message less uncomfortable. Symbolism demands reflection, and reflection demands time, study, and above all, a willingness to question established interpretations. Throughout history, simplified interpretations have been repeated because they were easier to teach, easier to control, and less dangerous. A literal apocalypse generates fear, but a symbolic apocalypse generates awareness, and awareness is not always convenient. There is also a fear of the symbol itself. When numbers, patterns, and structures are taken seriously, the text ceases to be something distant and begins to point to real systems, real behaviors, and real choices. This makes the book unsettling. It is safer to treat it as something that will happen someday, rather than as something that might be repeating itself now. Therefore, the code was never truly hidden. It was always in plain sight. What was lacking was the willingness to see beyond the surface, not because no one could perceive it, but because perceiving it would require abandoning comfortable interpretations. And perhaps that is precisely why so few bothered to look closely. The moment you begin to see the code of the apocalypse is also the moment something changes inside. The book ceases to be a source of fear and becomes a lens that reveals patterns, choices, and consequences that have always been in motion. Reading no longer provokes panic, but lucidity. Where there was once confusion, coherence arises. Where there was once terror, understanding is born. This new way of reading Revelation completely transforms the experience. Instead of looking for signs to flee from or dates to fear, the reader begins to observe behaviors, structures, and systems. The focus shifts from the spectacle of destruction to the process that leads up to it. The book stops shouting, "The end is near," and begins to whisper, "Pay attention to the path." Thus, the true warning of the apocalypse is revealed. It was not written to frighten future generations, but to awaken conscience in each generation. It shows what happens when certain patterns are maintained, when power becomes absolute, when truth is replaced by convenience. There is no fatalism, there is responsibility. The outcome is never imposed, it is constructed. When you see the code, the apocalypse ceases to be a menacing enigma and becomes a living warning, a warning that demands not fear, but vigilance. It asks not for panic, but discernment. And it is precisely this change of posture that prepares the ground for the final question that the book leaves open, and that few have the courage to face. When everything is put into perspective, the apocalypse ceases to be a book about the distant future and reveals itself as a mirror of humanity. It wasn't written to predict dates, calculate years, or fuel collective panic. The code of the apocalypse doesn't point to calendars, it reveals patterns of power, of choice, of repetition. It shows what happens whenever the same paths are followed, generation after generation. The final warning of the apocalypse is not "the world is going to end," but pay attention to what is being built. Whenever systems become absolute, whenever fear replaces conscience, whenever truth is traded for convenience, the same cycle approaches its limit. The book does not impose an inevitable end, it exposes the inevitable consequences. And that changes everything. Therefore, the apocalypse remains relevant, not because we are living through a unique moment, but because the patterns continue to repeat themselves. The text doesn't point the finger at a single time, nor at a single people. It observes humanity in motion, making the same choices, committing the same mistakes, expecting different results. And in doing so, it leaves a silent warning for those willing to see. Perhaps the apocalypse was never about the end of the world, but about the end of a way of life. If this content made you see the apocalypse in a way you never had before, leave a like. This helps the video reach more people who have also never heard this interpretation. Comment on what caught your attention the most, or if this code changed your view of the book. And if you want to continue exploring biblical mysteries, hidden patterns, and revelations that almost no one notices, follow the channel. Because the deeper we look, the harder it becomes to ignore what has always been right in front of us.